So just to frame it for you, we're gonna go over, like the mastery and what the key components are, the plan for the quarter, again, clarity on key lessons, and then we are going to review any changes, and then what lessons you wanna focus on with me and you, okay? So to jump into it, do you have any questions before we start? Okay. So, when looking at the Unit 3 internalization, what key ideas is necessary for this unit?
That students are able to draw connections from Unit 1 and Unit 2 and understand how homeostasis, how you can build upon Unit 1 and Unit 2 to understand homeostasis from cellular to organisms.
Okay. And talking about cellular to organisms, going a little bit more specific, what specific key points from Unit 1 and Unit 2 are going to be most beneficial for Unit 3?
So, understanding those cellular structures that we learned in Unit 2.
And cellular structures meaning animal cell?
Meaning, yeah, cell and plant.
Animal cell and plant cell, okay. And the different functions of the organelles,
Yeah.
okay. And then, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I saw something in the Unit 3 exam that ties back to carbon cycle and how we use, so we did that Unit 1, Unit 2, and now Unit 3 with respiratory and circulatory.
Yes.
So knowing how to draw those connections.
Yes, definitely important because they are like animal and plant cells and the carbon cycle and the different things and organelles that are impacted in the functions, and then even so moving, diving a little bit deeper, even going into enzymes.
Yeah.
When you look at the up and coming unit and the assessment, which tasks in particular are you most focused on, meaning what students may have misconceptions about, and what is going to lead the students to draw those connections between Unit 1 and Unit 2?
So one of the things that I really want to focus on, so I started the first week of Unit 3 already, because I moved the date of the exam.
Yeah.
But so far what I'm noticing is like the plasma membrane and how cells are being transported is one of the things that I'm really gonna have to keep going back to, especially the lesson yesterday. So for example, we're getting confused on how we diffuse molecules versus water, so with osmosis versus diffusion. Students are getting confused with that, I noticed already.
And so with osmosis and diffusion, knowing that it's the passive and active transport?
Yeah, and then knowing that with osmosis, we're moving the water, so we're gonna move to the side where it's more concentrated. So do we even understand what that language means? And like breaking that down further, I noticed I'm gonna have to do. And that's a big chunk of the exam.
So thinking about the osmosis and diffusion and then active transport and passive transport, and knowing that those are the key components and then the ones that they have the most misconceptions for. And so when you are breaking it down, and we can slowly process this, what do you think it will be, what's the highest leverage, which one is more the highest leverage to start with?
I think just understanding the basics of what is passive, what is active.
And so those are key vocabulary terms, right? And I remember doing this lesson like active and passive, and I had a rolling chair in my office. And so it would be like, hey, with active transportation, I need to put this energy there, right, to make sure it is happening. And then passive is like, it's just happening, right? You don't need as much energy. And just giving the kids the visual. And I think identifying the key conceptual misconceptions with them, you are going to be able to stamp it with visual models with the kids, okay? So just keep that in mind, like the visual models with the kids for active and passive, and then pushing in osmosis and diffusion, because we know we have two words, right? It's osmosis and diffusion, and then we have active and passive. And so separating those two, and then separating them, breaking them down, each of them, and then bring them together in the end. Okay? You got any questions about that?
So for me, like, I would want to like move slowly and like be able to like build upon and make sure they understand these key things. How would you go about making sure you're still planning your whole lesson, but like at the same time slowing down
To speed up?
Yeah.
One of my coaches would always say, slow down and speed up. I think it's just I think having those pieces of the lesson that are active for them, but it's a small portion of it, right? And that can be with manipulatives, right? And so it was you were talking about the penetration of the cell, and I was in class observing, right? And so you're saying it's penetrating the cell, right? But then think about your learners.
Yeah.
All of them may not know what penetrating the cell means, right? We know it's entering into something, right? Something that may be foreign or should be, able to enter the cell, but they don't know that. So it's just breaking down those conceptual thoughts into thinking steps. And so even, for example, like when you say it's penetrating the cell, okay, it is going into the cell, and then taking it back, and then that question. So when we are penetrating something, we are doing what? And then cold calling or having them turn and talk. And so I think more often students are engaged but afraid to be wrong. But if they have the opportunity to have the voice with their peers before in front of everyone, they'll be a little bit more confident to take the risk of sharing what that may mean or what they think it means. And it's also too about the processing of your thinking, your thinking steps, right? And also to sharing them out loud. Because think about our students, like they're visual and verbal learners, right? And so if I'm visually seeing something while you are verbally processing it, and I then remind the students, hey, my notes should look like this, then we can quickly close the gaps with those misconceptions when you give them those thinking steps, then give them the time to turn and talk with neighbors, and then coming back, stamping it, and then give them that individual practice and coming around, giving them that feedback. Kind of gets them like those more at-bats, because they have the at-bats are different. So now I have a turn and talk with my neighbor, right? The teacher is sharing her thinking thoughts verbally. Then I am independently processing it with the feedback, and then I'm coming back whole class. Okay? Other questions? Yeah.
With those more complex topics, I think I'm kind of struggling with, okay, I need time to be able to explain this, but I also need you to be able to practice it so you can do it on your own. And like having enough time for both of those, but not feeling like I'm getting behind.
Yeah. And so, that's just like the teacher move, right? And so what is the highest leverage, and then what can I quickly go over, right? And so that is then when you are internalizing that plan, like, okay, and that comes from data. So if we know that you give a exit ticket on active transportation, and it's an open-ended response, and students actually in one class score 70% or higher, while your lower class scores 30% or higher, and you identify the gap, then you know with your higher class, I can then move on to passive transportation, right? Where my lower class, I'm going to see what that gap is, address the gap, and then give them another at bat, and then see their independent work to see if we're able to move on. So you kind of like differentiate the teaching between the levels of mastery.
Okay.
Mhm. Anything else?
I think we'll talk about this later, but it's mostly about the quarterly plan.
Okay,
Yeah.
we'll get to that. And so now going through your assessment and looking, and after taking an assessment and reviewing, what questions in particular were you had the most, did you struggle with the most?
Well, starting off with these first 3 questions, there was a lot of like different vocabulary that I know that students have not seen at all, like sonication. Like, it's good that I'm doing this internalization because it's like, okay, these are words that I have to now introduce in class because I like they're not going to know what those words mean. And so that can even make it difficult to answer the question if you understand the concept, but
Yes.
what you're reading isn't in the language you understand.
Go into, because I had it pulled up as well. I hate when I pull my drive up and I can never find nothing. The unit 3 assessment. It is labeled unit 3, right? I just wish everything in my drive could just, I could talk to my drive and it pulls it back up for me. So with the first 3 questions, and go ahead and turn it over. And so thinking about the vocabulary for the first 3 questions, and so the students not being able to, do you think it's more of them not being able to pull prior knowledge to identify the vocabulary, or just them not being able to identify it because they've never been exposed to it?
So like, for example, like sonication, it just means vibrating at a high frequency, but they would need to know like what that would do to the actual like phospholipid molecules. Like how would that, they're not just straight out telling you, okay, we're gonna shake this and the molecules are gonna form this. So it's like you have to draw that connection too.
And then I'm just thinking, like, me processing this, and I just think about always, like, dolphins and whales and, like, the vibration and how they make the noise and how it echoes through the water and sends the energy from the noise is then making a motion in the water, right? And so when you are actually thinking about those vocabulary terms with the students, just take a step back, right? And so think about how you can get the students to internalize and interpret this information, whether or not they have the prior knowledge to or it's a new concept, right? And that goes into almost like the hook of things, right? And so even with the exposure and what moving forward, like think about the plans, and we're gonna go a little bit deeper, giving them the intro to it in homework, right? And so like these are vocabulary words that we will be working with this week or for the next 4 days. And then this is your homework. And then actually not giving them points for completion, but actual accuracy. And that can be a quick trading grade. And you already have those answers up, and you are trading and grading really quick, and then we're coming back, and then you are assessing if they're ready to move on or not in that moment. If not, we're stamping it, our paper matches board, and then we'll go into it, and always using that scientific language referring to those words. And so even we know biology, right? So we'll quickly describe something, and we can talk about it and know and understand it, but then it goes over the student's head because we know the details of it, but they need those thinking steps so they can conceptually understand it and process it when they're independent from us.
Other questions that I was looking at. So 24, it's like bringing back photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Like you need to know what the equation is to get this question correct. So, and the graphs are kind of complex as well. So
that's an IOD standard that's the photosynthesis and cellular respiration with a complex graph. And so that's data points, right? So knowing that on IA1 they didn't do well with complex graphs, right? And then also too, reviewing units 1 and units 2, photosynthesis was not at the 70% mastery or higher, right? And so knowing those 2 points of data and then going back to the gaps, right? Because there's still some gaps from those two. What can be done on your end as an instructor to make sure that the misconception is identified, addressed, and then stamped again what the correct way or how to reach mastery will be? So what can you do?
I can either do a do now passage where they're doing a complex graph and answering a question similar, and then making sure that I'm going over that particular question and that they've mastered it. And then I can also be reviewing photosynthesis or respiration at the same time.
I think it's just little reminders, right? And so your 3D diagram on the board now, so it's there, right? So every time I walk in, I'm conscious of it. It's there, it's on the board.